Yes, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for your time. Again, my name is Jeff Norquist. I am a graduate of Massadic's master's program in sociology, and I've been working since 2016 on my PhD, the topic of which is the meaning of technology resistance in US American culture, titled, "Do That Machine Got a Song to Sing?" Now this title, Do That Machine Got a Song to Sing, is in the African American vernacular, and it speaks to one of the key aspects of technology resistance discourse in the United States culture, that of a machine lacking a connection to a natural self, some sort of traditional soul and feeling. I accomplished my dissertation via 4 case studies represented by these photos on the slides. Early American literature, the folktale of John Henry, anti-television activism, and anti-digital life discourse of the 21st century. My choice of focus comes from my master's thesis of sorts, which studied a national traditional restoration festival in England in 1905. And what I found was very interesting in this theatrical production is that they endeavored greatly to hide technology to bolster the authenticity of the performance, the authenticity of its cultural message. So I started thinking about anti-technology as something to study. So I chose the United States for a variety of reasons. English language, it's my own culture, gives me some natural inputs. But I want to say that the United States is not anti-technology. And this has been shown very famously in the 1960s text, The Machine in the Garden by Leo Marx, which explored how pastoral discourse was used to actually incorporate a pro-technology orientation in American culture. America is not anti-technology, but some Americans are. And some of them are, at least some of the time, as we see various debates around us about technologies. Most famous, and where I kind of started my investigation, was with the American domestic terrorist, Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. In his words, he said, "All these technical advances taken together have created a world in which the average man's fate is no longer in his own hands, but in those of politicians, corporate executives, and remote anonymous technicians and bureaucrats." This is another strain of American discourse, anti-technology discourse, in which the subject of control of oneself and by elites is a serious topic. Kaczynski bombed university technology labs in his effort to destroy a technological future. It was a bad place for me to start, in the sense that Ted Kaczynski is a single individual. He has no affiliations with any broad movements or institutions. So I needed to find a way to access exactly that. So my investigation foci in these 4 case studies are representative of broad movements, institutions, and spans of time. In fact, friends, I have data representing at least every single decade of the United States history from 1776 to the current decade of the 2020s. My methodology was purposive sampling in terms of literature and John Henry, TV activism, and anti-digital life discourse. I went over just literally hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of texts and sources of discourse. I boiled down in each case study to a representative research corpus, a representative example that I felt showed the highlights of the discourse. I aimed to get to unmediated discursive works, the very literature, work songs, manifestos, and blog posts in which anti-technology sentiment was expressed. This is the up from the dirt sentiment, unmediated by meta-commentary or historical description. My theoretical orientation, as Elisa indicated, is cultural sociology, like many of us. I'm trying to meet the tenets of a strong program in cultural sociology where culture is an independent variable. You'll see from the tables of sacred and profane that I set up, I'm following Emil Durkheim's direction to look at these binary oppositions and how they structure the way we respond to the world. Specifically, my theoretical filters are Jeffrey Alexander's cultural pragmatics. You see the elements of social performance and how they need to be fused by this diagram here. That is one of the lenses which I examine these materials. The other, and prominently, is the theory of the civil sphere. This idea that there's a civil space where the values and sacred ideas of the culture are being employed by competing actors to assert the primacy of their ideas and institutions. Lastly, I lightly use in the current draft the structure of narrative theory that Philip Smith borrowed from Northrop Frye. I might make this more robust in my final draft, but this is the idea that there are a limited number of ways to tell a story, and that that can describe what the aims of some of the people writing the story or the narrative are trying to accomplish. Okay, so let me get into the individual case studies. Early US American literature. I examined texts that spanned from as early as 1650 to as late as 1912, but I was predominantly in the 1800s. Why this? I had trouble finding, like, how am I going to get this started in terms of establishing what American culture is, and who had the voice in the civil sphere in the 1700s and the 1800s. Of course, let's turn to the rich and famous authors who helped establish what the American culture was about, what the American identity was. Talking Washington Irving, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Herman Melville, Emily Dickinson, Thoreau, Twain, Edgar Allan Poe, Margaret Fuller. These folks shaped US American culture, identified our identities. This literature can be broken down into two broad movements of the time. Romanticism, which ran from about 1800 to 1860. And this was broadly connected to the idea of the natural self and traditional ways of being challenged by the results of the Enlightenment. Realism was also a response to Enlightenment, but it was, as the title stated, endeavoring to show how things really were. And this emerged as industrialization and capitalism had really taken hold in the society. And here's what I found in terms of the binary structure of technology discourse. The discourse intimated that when you set yourself away from technology, you were participating more in tradition. You were more natural. You had greater independence, whereas those using technology were set aside from nature because they had manufactured products and they had a dependency on technology. Also, the technology had a profit motive versus a human progress motive. Kind of sticking in with the idea of tradition and in nature is this elevation of wisdom and enchantment that came from traditional cosmologies. There was a dignity assumed from a natural engagement with nature and an esteem that came from having a role that technology eventually took away from people. So the blacksmith in the village was an esteemed individual. Later, that person worked in a factory. They were a simple cog in the machine. Very similar to a lot of findings in similar areas, there was this elevation of the rural and the local. And then, interestingly, this notion of skills came in very strongly. The idea that we knew how to manipulate the world around us with our own skills, rather than having machines do this work for us. The Ballot of John Henry. Many of you might not know what this is. It's a folk tale that is very, very prominent. The most prominent folk tale in American folklore. It tells the story of a railroad worker, a freed slave post-Civil War, who was working on the railroad. He was the strongest, the fastest, the best. He was also morally pure, devoted to his family and his community. So this song, this ballad emerged from the work songs these workers would sing on the railroad while they were building the railroad. It was then reiterated in ballads, folk tales, poems, stage shows and films perpetually throughout American culture. The most recent example that I look at is from 2013, a film from 2013. And this emerged from the railroad crews in the 1870s. You look at the sacred and profane elements in the Ballot of John Henry table, and you see many of the same concerns. Tradition and nature, community and family. These are the things that are at stake as technology comes into play. Those who do not embrace the sacred are antisocial, focused on themselves, upon a profit motive, gain and excess. They're not willing to sacrifice. They are separate from religious feeling and duty and devotion. Again, we see dignity and esteem as a big topic here. These workers were trying to find their way into participating in the future of America. Technology was taking that away. Identity and anonymity, industrious versus laziness and idle. Now, the crux of the John Henry story is that John Henry went into a competition with a machine. Okay, they brought in a machine, said, I can beat it. And he did beat it. He did beat it in the competition, but then he died moments later from the exertion. So this is kind of a very dramatic scene, and that's where some of the narrative theory in terms of different narratives came in useful to me. Very interestingly, though, it's fascinating how these rich and famous, very educated, wealthy authors and these illiterate workers on the railroad came up with almost the same structure, even though there was probably very little in the way of cross-pollination outside of their participation in American culture. So I thought that was very much of a bolstering of my findings. I want to have this quick aside about the Ballot of John Henry. John Henry emerged in African-American folk culture, was taken up into the 1920s and 30s by white culture, and they treated it very differently. The everyman versions by white authors, I labeled them, were very correspondent to the romantic side of sacrality, whereas the protest versions by black authors focused on the exploitation of the workers and the exploitation of the capitalist system were very much correspondent with realist themes. And you can see from these two pictures, kind of two different treatments. The Disney version, John Henry, oh, it was good fun to take on the machine. It's just, I'm an energetic guy. I like working. The other one is much more grim. It shows two workers working hard, even though the technology is bearing down upon them, and all the rich people in the top hats in the background are just watching. Okay. All right. Now, anti-television activism. Activist activities and prominent manifestos were my research corpus, and mostly this happened from the advent of TV in the mainstream post-World War II. So I'm looking at things published, groups active, and items published between 1949 and 1997. I list my research corpus here because it's interesting to talk about them as individuals. NAFBRAT, the National Association for the Betterment of Radio and Television, it just rolls right off the tongue. Very prominent and active from 1949 into the 1960s in manipulating public opinion and influencing United States Congress action, congressional action. It was a moral crusade. Television was turning people into juvenile delinquents, taking them away from traditional elements of society. Then the three books that you see in the middle, The Plug-in Drug, The 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television, and Amusing Ourselves to Death, emerged through the 70s and 80s. And these purported to be scientific investigations. By our standards as academics, they come up short. However, they were very influential. They even have Wikipedia pages and 20th anniversary editions. Okay, that's how influential they were. Okay, they really talked about some of the same moral problems, but now they introduced issues of health and psychology, reflecting the mainstream of certain psychological concepts in the United States. Okay, then TV turnoff week that started in the 1990s and 1994, also predicated on health. Let's find out how much healthier and happier we could be if we took a week off or a month off. Okay, they're still active today, although what is TV is really kind of hard to say. So now it's called screen-free week. Okay? And then also in the 1970s, you have another moral crusade, Senator Joseph Lieberman. With the explosion of cable television came a lot of low-brow fare, okay? And he was outraged, and he tried to, through the United States Congress and Senate, legislate content on television. Let's look again at yet another chart, a binary structure of anti-television discourse. Again, we're seeing repetitive themes. Television is taking us away from classical culture. It's superficial rather than letting us grow in depth. It makes us alienated from our community. We lack civic responsibility. We have disregard for those around us. It is affecting our psychological development. Also, pro-sociality, which here is kind of a stand-in for skills, the ability to communicate to others, the ability to interact with your fellow citizen. And then again, we have this control, self-determination. Now, though, because of this psychological aspect, control is not just economic control by the elites, but it's addiction. We are controlled and we are addicted to television. And yeah, and it's taken away our motivation, our proactivity. We've become passive. And lastly, the fourth case study is on digital life resistance. Digital life is defined as the parts of our life world that are mediated by technology. So emails, smartphones, social media, etc. We all see this debate in our society around us as to whether phones and social media are healthy. Okay, so this is very recent stuff, only from 2008 till 2021, regarding the impact of digital life on our lives. I got to this primarily through personal blogs, a couple books, a couple novels, but mostly personal blogs, which again, this up from the dirt idea. People sitting down at their desk or in their bed with their laptop saying, I'm just gonna fire off a blog post about what I think about smartphones. Okay, you can't get closer to the dirt when it comes to discourse there. Now, as it says at the bottom, it further extends the psychology discourse. So that comes from this television idea, but also from this television resistance is this highly prominent concern for the real. People are now participating in worlds that are considered divorced from the material world. So we see this, all these things reflected in the binary structure of anti-digital life discourse. I broke it up into macro, sacred, and profane categories. Authenticity versus inauthenticity, self-determination versus control. Authenticity is comprised of material reality. We're in a room with real people and real objects. We're having this face-to-face contact. That allows for greater depth of feeling and connection. And because we have that greater depth, that interaction is more honest. It is a place to practice and develop social skills. So we have the opportunity to learn how to express our feelings and talk to other people and participate in that civil sphere, right? Meanwhile, yeah, we get the whole self-determination versus control. Again, we're talking about dependency. People are said to be addicted to these technologies, and they are unable to act independently. They are constantly drawn back to their phones. Then health versus disorder. There's a lot in this discourse about disorder, how it's making people mentally ill, making people addicted. So that continues there. And then this idea of productivity, which also kind of works in the sense of skills. People they don't have the wherewithal to focus on their work and accomplish things. They're constantly distracted by technologies. So that's the digital life resistance. So I bring all these together into my conclusions. In sum, my dissertation has uncovered what Alexander says we need to find: the collective emotions and ideas, in this case, which construct discourse on resisting or critiquing technology. I am, in the current 21st century parlance, trying to solve what are Americans talking about when they talk about resisting technology. And I find that technology resistance is predicated on notions of a natural and autonomous self, as I've shown, descended from critiques of the Enlightenment. Its reason and rationality had been elevated over traditional cosmologies, and the reaction to that is still manifesting in contemporary resistance to technology narratives. Here you see a table, a binary structure of anti-technology discourse in US American culture that is an amalgamate of the four previous tables. We see macro binaries of natural and self-determination. The natural is comprised of traditional communities, traditional wisdom and cosmologies. There's fetishization of the authenticity in terms of real and material, but also in terms of authentic meaning honest. On the profane side is the techno-scientific, which only breeds alienation. It provides knowledge, but not wisdom. The objects in which we create are created by machines rather than by individuals and artisans using their skills. And it has a commercial motive and therefore is not honest in what it's promising to us in their sales pitch, you could say. Self-determination versus control. We are said to have greater self-reliance and proactivity and skills when we do not engage with technology that would take things in a more natural way. Our health is greater. Those of us who fail to take that route are dependent, passive, we lack skills, we suffer from disorders. All right, implications and contributions. First, let's talk about the contributions to cultural sociology itself. The thematic consistency in my findings validate the approach of a strong program. Culture is shown in my study to remain more or less consistent in its core interpretations of sacrality vis-a-vis technology across more than 250 years of data. Also, it's a contribution to cultural sociology in that resistance to technology is vastly overlooked as a topic of inquiry in general, particularly vis-a-vis meaning, which is a central concern of cultural sociology. This is strange because we have a huge movement called the digital detox movement that prizes these very ideas of sacrality. We have constant debates about cell phones and email and Zoom, and nonetheless, there's not a lot going on in cultural sociology. There is some other technology studies doing resistance studies, but they're not focused on meaning and identity by and large. And then, hey, I looked over some of the most prominent cultural sociology journals. I looked at every title over the last 2 years in cultural sociology and the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, and almost none of them refer to technology, at least in the titles. They might in the content, but not in the titles. So there's an opportunity there for you folks who are looking for a niche. Okay, I seem to have found it. Okay, other implications and contributions, public health. Look at these two signs from anti-vax protesters. I choose natural immunity, mandatory vaccine, will not live in fear, freedom is essential. Okay, here's the two concerns, nature and self-determination. And anti-vaccination movements employ the same strains. Vaccines are a natural method of social control. Their narratives are heavily based on the health and development of children, much like those of digital life and television. And the profit motive is often highlighted. Okay, so this shows space for developing health promotions which address these cultural-based narratives and concerns. Okay, also, I also have a Master's of Science in a corporate degree, Information and Knowledge Strategy. One of our core concerns there is in change management, which is often a technology-focused thing. And organizational change management gives attention to how change can be made attractive to people and what's actually going on for people as they experience change. Meaning, right? But here's the thing, it almost never refers to culture in our sense of culture. Always corporate culture, workplace culture, but not culture. And it's silly to think that that doesn't make its way into the corporate world. So this is an opportunity, especially with the increased pace of technological change in organizations due to COVID, okay? Where my dissertation and these findings and further study in this area might actually be helpful in the corporate world. Okay, that's it. I'd like to thank a few people and all of you. First, Nadia Yavorsky for, Dr. Yavorsky for being my advisor and guiding me through all this. I'd like to give a shout out to Dr. Binder in the Supper Club, who did a great workshopping of one of my case studies. Thank you to all of you here at the department. I know there's been some question over the last 5-6 years. What is this guy actually up to? Now you know. Now you know. And I want to thank all of you for your time and attention from your day. Much appreciated. Thank you.